Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.
TheFirestore.com, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can make the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at thefirestore.com and shop our deals page.
Welcome to this edition of Fire and Training with Chief Doug Cline. I am not Chief Doug Cline, but I'm your fill-in host, Christopher Naum. I want to welcome you here to our episode of Fire and Training with Chief Cline. Chief Cline will be joining us here momentarily. I'm actually one of his guests on his program here tonight, but again, it's always a pleasure to welcome our audience to Chief Cline's Fire and Training episode here on fireengineering.com. We're very excited. We're kicking off a new series here for our podcast over the next couple of episodes. So I'm going to take a few moments to let you all know what we're planning on doing and give you some ability to schedule out some of our future programs here, both on Chief Cline's Fire and Training podcast, as well as on my Buildings on Fire Taking to the Streets program. So we had talked about a couple of things in our previous two episodes, both on Chief Cline's episode as well as on my last episode here, talking about some of the emerging issues dealing with Fireground, talking about tactical windows, talking about some of the challenges with buildings and occupancy types. One of the things that we made mention of in both of our last episodes was that we were contemplating rolling out a series that would provide some more in-depth insights versus some of the more shorter version podcasts and webcasts that you're normally accustomed to gain some better insights and gain some better depth on the topic. And that topic is the commercial fireground. Today's fireground, when we talk about commercial buildings and occupancies and structures, continue to stress and challenge just about all organizations, from the smallest rural department to the largest metro and urban-sized department, based upon the uniqueness of both old and new commercial buildings, as well as the fire loading packages, the conditions encountered, civilian load capacities, and other related factors that are affecting the fireground when we do have incidences of these types. So I'm very pleased to roll out and announce our new series as we finish off 2023 and as we prepare to roll into 2024. And again, we're kicking off here on Fire and Training on Chief Cline's program, our Fireground, the Commercial Fireground series of the Commercial Fireground FACTS, F-A-C-T-S, the FACTS series dealing with commercial buildings, fireground operations, training, preparedness, and such. So our first episode here on Fire and Training is going to talk about the commercial fireground, dealing with today's challenges and some of the preparedness issues that are affecting all of us in terms of keeping up to date with new construction, keeping up to date with the commercial adaptive reutilization of our buildings, as well as renovations, alterations, and other conversions that are affecting a variety of different buildings that go from some occupancy, whether it be commercial to begin with, or into new establishments and new commercial occupancies that either have similar or different levels of risk. So part one is going to be, again, the challenges affecting today's fireground, dealing with commercial fire operations, today's challenges in preparation. Part two of our series, which will roll into our Buildings on Fire Taking to the Streets segment that I'll be hosting directly, we'll be talking about building construction and some of the related risks regarding the first arriving construction, tactics, and safety. So we'll talk a little bit more about construction-related impacts, whether they be the standalone commercial building or what we're all very familiar with when we talk about the big box types of structures and some of those related aspects. Part three of our series will be the commercial fireground, dealing with the operational side. And we're very pleased to be able to let you know that we'll have a number of guests that'll be coming into that particular program, which will include Chief Aaron Heller out of New Jersey, Chief Jason Hulverman out of Missouri, Chief Doug Cline will be on the program, and we may have one other guest that we're still waiting to get some confirmation on. But we will certainly have three very well-established, credentialed individuals who can talk more about some of the related issues dealing with the operational side. So our first episode, again, challenges related and preparation related issues. Part 2 of our series will talk about building construction and some of the associated risks that are inherent of those particular buildings. Part 4 of our series will deal with the operational side of the commercial Fireground. And we are also hoping to have a 4th part of our series, and that's still in our tentative stages right now. But part 4 of our commercial Fireground series will deal with lessons and learnings and the new risks. And we'll talk more about some of the emerging hybrid related structures, especially when we talk about cross-laminate timber, mass timber, but more importantly, the hybrid related types of structures that are affecting our buildings, both for the standalone and then what we call the small footprint commercial buildings. So that is going to be our four-part multiple series coming about here that we're kicking off here on Chief Cline's Fire and Training. So we actually rolled out about 3 years ago, we did just a 2-part series. Chief Cline and I talked a little bit about the commercial Fireground. We had a couple of guests that included Jim Duffy, Chief Duffy out of Connecticut, Chief Danny Sheridan out of FDNY, and we talked about the emerging issues dealing with commercial buildings. And for many of us that have had experience dealing with commercial Fireground, we know all too well the challenges and the associated risks with these particular occupancy types. There is a very distinct difference in these buildings, especially when we talk about the era and vintage in which these buildings were built, the associated type of construction and the anatomy of these particular buildings, and how that construction, building anatomy, the era and vintage, how those things play together to influence our command decision-making, our company level deployment, the task level tactical approaches, and many of the other aspects that affect Fireground operations. Again, both from all the way from the company level of the first company coming in to the assemblance of the first alarm assignment, and then ultimately what normally, in many instances, I shouldn't say normally, but in many instances when we have escalating events that normally occur from the all hands to greater alarms, box still alarms, and so forth, to the greater alarm types of events where we have that distinctive need in a timely fashion to have a greater degree of resources based upon the size, the complexity of the buildings, but more importantly, the size, the footprint, the volume, and the fire loading that normally we are encountering based upon our initial arrivals and the conditions that we're encountering. So there are certainly a lot of challenges that are associated with these particular related buildings and those conditions and the related aspects that come about. So we really look forward to having you listen in at some point with our podcasts and now our combined webcast series that we are very, very fortunate to have available to us here through our good friends here at fireengineering.com, which, again, I really encourage you to take the time and invest in seeking out and taking a look at the archived programs that are available within the vast library of the podcast programs on fireengineering.com, and take a look at the subject area, take a look at the content, and more importantly, the variety of both podcasters, the primary producers, and the authors of those, as well as the guests. There is a tremendous degree of opportunity to take into account some very stimulating and some very thought-provoking and very insightful types of educational programs here that fire engineering is always known for, and that extends as part of our podcast and the webcast series. So some really, really good things coming about. I will take a couple of moments here to make mention of some of the upcoming things that are occurring here as we wait a little bit for Chief Cline to come into the program. Again, FDIC is just around the corner. So again, April will not be too far away when we talk about April of 2024. FDIC is shaping up to be another stellar opportunity for those of you that are longtime attendees, as well as any of those of you that are thinking about attending as being a first-time attendees and so forth. I really encourage you to take a look at the agendas and the programs as they are being published and pushed out. I know that recently some of the initial video clips that are promoting some of the programs are coming about. I myself will have the distinct pleasure and the honor and privilege to be presenting a 4-hour workshop in the early couple of days of FDIC, talking about building facts, first arriving construction tactics and safety, talking about size-up considerations, and a significant portion of our 4-hour program as part of the workshop will include a component dealing with the commercial Fireground. It's actually part of a national program that we do that is inclusive of both a stand face-to-face program with a 4-hour and a multi-hour type program series that gets into really the details of both construction, operational aspects, performance-based issues, dealing with the commercial Fireground from our model of building facts, first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. And if we think about how those three components fit into that first arriving, that 10 to 15 to 20 minute window that we have in which construction directly influences our tactical approach, decision-making process, and how that ultimately also influences our safety and risk management of those incidents. It's certainly a foundation of our modeling that many of you have come to know very well in our programs and our presentations, our dialogues and discussions in many of our programs, both in Chief Cline's program as well as on Buildings on Fire, Taking It to the Street. So I encourage you to take the opportunity to look at our upcoming program and see if that might fulfill some needs from a training standpoint. There are numerous other exceptional both workshops that are going to be presented at FDIC 2024, as well as an exceptional compilation of classroom presentations, as well as the keynotes, opening ceremonies, as well as the hands-on programs. Speaking of which, I do want to also indicate that we will more than likely be streaming live from the floor of FDIC as we did this past year in 2023, right from the Fishbowl, which is that Four Corners area there in the convention center. We will be presenting live one of our podcasts and webcast programs with a variety of different guests that we'll have on our program. So we'll be looking forward to doing that live from FDIC on a date to be determined. And then in addition to our formal classroom session, we have been authorized and been given the approval to do a separate off-site, meaning off the grounds of the convention center, but we will have a after hours reading the buildings walking tour. And you'll see some more things coming up here in the next couple of weeks and certainly over the next couple of months, talking about taking the classroom into the streets. One of our flagship programs nationally has been the Buildings on Fire Taking to the Streets, reading the buildings programs, where we actually take the classroom into the streets, do size up and do street lectures, curbside conversations, talking about building construction related back to the built environment, and what better place to do that is in the built environment and within the streets. So we're looking to take our particular workshop program out of the classroom from FDIC and into the streets of Indianapolis on a date yet to be determined. So keep an eye on that, and that is going to be just an extra. We will have limited spots available. It will be a pre-registered event so that we can ensure that we can manage the potential audience that may be interested in coming. If there are more interest levels than spots are available, we will also take a look at maybe offering that on a couple of different dates and times. And again, it'll be during the off hours at the conclusion of the daily programs and official training programs of FDIC, but it will be an extension of FDIC that we'll be offering for those of you that may have an interest. In addition to that, one of the other features that we have been doing quite well over the last 3 years at FDIC, both prior to COVID and then kicking that back up again 2 years ago, is reading the buildings. And we'll have some extensive online social media postings of buildings, construction size up. So again, take a look and be aware of some of those things that'll be coming up here in the not too distant future. So let's get into a little bit of our program here as we start talking about some of the issues and into our conversation, again, exploring the commercial Fireground relative to today's challenges as they relate back to preparation, both pre-fire planning, pre-incident intel, training issues, and so forth. And that'll be part of our conversation here on Fire and Training on Chief Cline's program. One of the things that I do want to make you aware of, that there are two very distinctive, actually there's three distinctive resources that I'll draw your attention to, and two of which are certainly required readings that I would highly encourage you to take a look at, and the third is one of our continuing conversations on where can you gain some additional leverage and insights regarding your particular training and knowledge increase to help promote your skill set level within your particular current rank and position of authority, as well as some of the future positions that you may be seeking to attain. And one of those required reading books is Francis D.K. Ching, or Francis Ching, C-H-I-N-G, Building Construction Illustrated. And again, there are a number of editions that are currently available. You can get to those particular books either online through Amazon.com or any other resources and so forth that you might have an interest in. But again, I would highly encourage you to take a look at and obtain Francis Ching's Building Construction Illustrated as one of the books that will certainly help you gain some additional knowledge and insights on building construction. The second two required readings that I would highly encourage you to take a look at would also include two documents that are very specific to our conversation here on the commercial Fireground. And the second document is Underwriters Laboratories, or UL's study on the coordinated fire attack utilizing acquired structures, and then the exploratory analysis of the impact of ventilation on strip mall fires. Both of those particular books, those two particular reports are very insightful. They are what we would consider to be advanced level readings and insights. But again, if you want to gain some further insights on the complexities and demands, especially in preparation for our Part 3 series dealing with operational perspectives, I would encourage you to take a look at those. And then lastly, the other document, which currently is available as a free access document, and that would be on the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, and that documented is the NFPA 1700 Guide for Structural Firefighting. And that was published and issued in 2021, and it'll give you some very good insights on different occupancy types as they relate to tying back in some of the emerging theories and insights that we've gotten from both research and development, and how that ties into some of the emerging issues that we'll be talking about here in our 4 multi-part series on the commercial Fireground. So two very interesting documents that I would encourage you to take a look and get some insights on. So that's sort of the basis of where we're going into our program. And again, what I'm getting ready to do now is to introduce our host on Fire and Training that all of you very well have become very well known for and good friends of, and that's Chief Doug Cline. So, Doug, it's glad to. I'm just filling and keeping your seat warm here as we got kicking off of our program in anticipation of you joining us. So, it's your show, and again, I've just led everybody into our Part 1 program talking about this episode as part of our kickoff series for our 4-part series on the commercial Fireground, talking about on today's episode challenges and preparation. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, boss.
Well, Chris, thank you for filling in. I apologize for being slightly delayed. Doing preparation work is exactly what we were doing today in an assessment center with a regional department, helping them out as they were testing some lieutenants. But, you know, part of what comes with that is we're talking here about our commercial building, this 4-part series, which is I'm just stoked about. Anytime that we can be able to get into and plan the depth of conversation and information and training that we're going to put out, it's always exciting to get to that point. And the first part of that, we always start everything out with, it was like the series on the resort fires. We started out talking about all these different resorts, but how you start preparation and how you start understanding what's going on in your streets, in your town, your jurisdiction, the types of buildings, how you train for those, what are some of the considerations and the tactics you got to put into play. And that's kind of where we're going to go tonight with the commercial Fireground, the new challenges, being prepared. And I think that's the key word, being prepared. And as we look at this, our buildings are drastically changing. And it's an ever evolving component that's going on, the growth that's going on in some of the parts of the United States. South Carolina specifically is experiencing that. I was just in West Virginia over the weekend, and some of the areas that we're driving through, the types of commercial structures that are popping up is, really unique. And some of these are the bigger box stores that are coming in. A lot of them are the smaller standalone, what we call big box stores with the Dollar Generals and the Family Dollars, those type of things. But we're seeing commercial strip malls pop up that aren't the large traditional L-shaped or U-shaped type construction features that are in there, or the dynamics that go with that, but a smaller, a more linear type that may only have 4 or 5 stores. And we're seeing those all over the place here. I saw a bunch in West Virginia as I was traveling through there, through Virginia and North Carolina. Both of those, a lot of things that were popping up. So really excited about what we're doing, Chris. So let's dive in deep and let's begin talking about getting out into your streets. You were talking about that earlier as we were getting in right as I was coming on with taking it to the streets, getting out there, getting a look, knowing what's in your jurisdiction. So let's talk about that pre-planning concept.
Well, I think it goes without saying, if you don't know what's going on in your first due, then what is it that you're doing? If you do not have an appreciation and are not monitoring conditions surrounding whether it be your first due or the larger encompassing jurisdictional area of your department's response area, whether it be the first due, a battalion, a division, or if you're in a smaller type of geographical footprint, the entire response area of your organization department. You have to have a pulse of that. But what is going on outside on your streets, beyond the apron of the fire station is so critical, especially when we talk about the aspects of the commercial building. The commercial building, whether it be, and we'll talk more about the characteristics and the categorization of those in our part 2 episode under construction and so forth, but buildings in the commercial realm, just like residential structures, have very distinctive characteristics, whether we talk about the standalone all the way to the big box. But it's very, very important for us, meaning the fire service, especially as company and commanding officers, to recognize, number one, to identify and recognize what it is that's occurring, whether it be new construction or renovation of our buildings, identifying the occupancy type and the occupancy risks that are associated with that particular building, and then gaining some additional insights regarding the construction, the footprint, and what's going to go in there. I mean, the simplest part of it, what's going to go into this commercial building and how is that going to be impacting me, meaning the company, the fire station, the fire department, in response to future incidences and so forth. So if we're not aware of our world and our environment, we're not getting out on the streets, whether it's going past these buildings, going to other alarms, or whether we consciously stop and deliberately engage ourselves with our companies to identify some information, whether it be through the contractors or through self-exploration at the company level or the individual level, seeing what's going on, doing some observations, talking about some things at the curbside with our personnel, and more importantly, gaining further insights from a technical standpoint from those that are building the buildings, developing the buildings, or lastly, the occupants of the buildings. So it's not always the construction side of it. We may be aware of a existing building that's been renovated, a new commercial occupancy is taking place. Now let's stop and talk to the owners. Let's talk to the tenants and ask some questions about what's going on in that building.
Well, Chris, one of the things that I was just thinking, and I just reached back into the the tools that I got to get into the NFPA pre-incident survey standard. And, one of the things that I recognize is when we go to pre-plan these buildings, when we get out looking at the streets, part of what we really want to get into is knowing a couple of things. And one is we need to begin with the dirt that it's sitting on. What type of area are you in? Does it have a basement? Does it have, a different owner for the actual dirt or the space? Who owns the building? And then who are the tenants inside the building? Who are the occupants? And I think that gets down to where we got to talk and focus on, a couple of different things, because one of the things it talks about in the process is being involved in roles and responsibilities of what you're doing there. So one of the pieces I asked in a question, we were talking about training this weekend at the program where I was at, and really looking at the signs that your training program's failing you. And one of them is, are you going out and pre-planning your jurisdiction and then training based upon what your pre-plans are? So understanding, what your challenges are, just like we talked in resort fires, commercial buildings are the same way. Depending on where they're sitting on that piece of dirt, what's the backside look like? Does it drop off? Do we have good access? Do we not have good access? Are we going to be able to advance hose lines? Can we throw ladders? Can we position apparatus? All that begins with that first feature of that. And then when we get into the building itself is all the construction stuff. And we'll get into that in part 2 and talk about the different types. But I want to focus a little bit on the occupancy, is because some of these buildings are good size, especially when we begin thinking about tactical deployments or what are we going to be doing to train for these? How do we get people ready? Do we really know what we're up against? And I asked a question. I said, how many people have been 100 to 150 feet deep inside one of these commercial buildings? All of them have commercial buildings, and that's something they got to stop and think about. Is a commercial building is much more than we think of these huge occupancies. But, I think about a church is a commercial building in a sense. It's a place of worship, but it is a commercial building. We think about gas stations or convenience stores. We think about our, quick access to fast food restaurants. Those are commercial buildings. So when you ask that question and you only get 1 or 2 hands that go up, that tells me that our experience level is extremely low, which makes it even more critical as we talk about getting out into your streets and beginning, your training process. And one of the areas I talked about that we were failing so much in is we tend to not plan very well for our training. We don't look at what we actually have, and we don't match our training to our responses. We try to be, touch this, touch that, or we'll train on what's just fun or what we like. But I think we got to begin looking at our training programs where we're actually training on what is the demographics and the potential response capabilities of what you have versus what you're going to be up against, your challenges within your jurisdiction. And I think back to Gordon Graham and his model when he draws on the screen of his Elmo now. It used to be the overhead projector. And it's the types of responses you're doing. Your high risk, low frequencies are some of the things that we're talking about here with these commercial structures. And what do you know about them? And are you prepared? And I think that's a big piece that we really need to get people thinking about when we're doing pre-planning and when we're out, and especially developing training programs that are specific to what your jurisdiction is, especially as a company officer or, in the volunteer department, you're only meeting a couple of nights or so a month. It's critical that you're out doing these things.
Well, you bring up some really good points there, Doug. Part of it, I think that as we get into this conversation is this position of complacency. We don't recognize the potential risk of these particular buildings. It is another structure. It's another building that we have some degree of knowledge on, some type of training that we've trained on other types of buildings, but maybe not from a standpoint of the uniqueness of the commercial structure, because commercial construction, commercial buildings are certainly significantly different than the residential structures, although we may have large area residentials, as we've talked about on both of our programs with mega mansions or mech mansions as commonly referred to, but commercial buildings that are upwards of 15, 20, or 30,000 square feet or higher present significant challenges that, again, we primarily stretch the line. We entered into the structure. We are not considering air management. We're not considering deployment. We're not considering orientation, trying to maintain integrity of being able to make our way back out under duress. And again, there are many events and incidences that come to mind when we talk about case studies that we'll talk about in one of our future episodes. But again, some of the challenges just coming about when we talk about the March 2001 event at the Southwest Supermarket fire in Arizona, the whole issues dealing with a routine fire in a commercial building and how rapidly and escalating that particular event occurred. Or the other one that comes to mind is the commercial fire that occurred in a very small strip mall application in Michigan, which dealt with a line of duty death of a very young firefighter who was trapped about, so it was 300, if I'm not mistaken. So it was about 300 feet from front to rear, and they were about 150 foot into the building, as you just was describing, and there was a structural collapse, entrapment, and unfortunately we had one firefighter that was killed, 3 others that were injured in 2013 in that commercial fire. So it's that complacency creep that comes in either because of the lack of experience in commercial fire events, or it's the lack of building intel, both pre-incident intel or other intel that should be obtained as we are engaging in that building during the course of our operations, and then adjusting accordingly based upon what we are learning more about that particular building. And it ultimately goes back to conservative bias, having a much greater respect for what can go wrong in commercial buildings than any other type of structure.
You know, and I'm going to read something specifically out of 1620 in NFPA, Chapter 4, Point 7. It says training, pre-incident planning process shall include the provision for training and education for those portions of the pre-incident plan that involve unique and unusual operations. Now, for the most part, and if we're not having a lot of folks that have been inside these buildings, or we're not getting a lot of fires near jurisdiction in commercial buildings that we're talking about, those become unique. And the considerations that have to be taken into consideration and deployed and practiced is critical. So one of the things we know that has happened multiple times, we've seen this in NIOSH reports, Chris, and we've talked about this on previous shows, is that we go into deploying residential tactics on commercial buildings. And even in, we talked about this in the McMansion show about some of the size of these buildings that are residential require commercial tactics. Well, anytime you go into a commercial building, we definitely need to be deploying different tactics. And this time of year specifically, I think about the fuel loading that goes into these with the Christmas holidays, the higher levels of stock that are there, the types of decorations that are put up and then sold, and there's a lot of challenges that go into this that I don't think our people necessarily always think about.
No.
It's just a building.
You make a great point, and let me just interject here. So our listeners, so this is the holiday season. We're in the month of December as this episode is being published and put out. I would encourage, for those of you that are, again, timely in a timely standpoint, if this is the month, get out there and take a look at whether it be a small commercial retail building or the large box stores, and take a look at the fire load that's obvious that we are seeing from the storefronts, that you're entering access ways that now normally are quite open and accessible to the kinds of things that in certain brand stores are now loaded up with different types of displays and materials and commodities, and whatever it is that you're looking for are going to be there. So we've increased fire load. We are decreasing other potential life safety considerations within the building, but the fire load that's present in the obvious part of the public side of the building, now start asking the question, what's in the loading dock and the storage areas behind the behind the walls in the non-public side. And the stuff that's there in the retail standpoints in particular, whether it be decorative or part of the retail commercial stuff that you're going to be buying, and how that dramatically changes considerations on operations. I mean, there's no question, and what better time to look at that than during these periodic holiday seasons. So it's not only the holiday period that we're currently in, although this is probably the most significant in terms of its overall impact. It normally starts back in the August, September timeframe when shipments are starting to be brought in. I mean, this stuff doesn't just show up overnight. There is this periodic increase of commodities and inventory, and then eventually it goes from the storage side to the public side that we now are seeing. So we've got to recognize those, because those things will dramatically change our operation perspectives. But you talked about this other aspect here. We talk about residential tactics and we talk about commercial tactics. And when we talk about the unusual circumstances, number one, what's the frequency of commercial fires that you've gone to? And I'm not talking about just responding to of an odor, or more commonly when we talk about an alarm drop, even alarm activation, typically a sprinkler drop because of pressurization or other related things that require some work and activities beyond the first alarm assignment. There are standpipe operations. There are hydraulics related to a variety of different risers and manifolds and sprinkler systems that are going to be specific to certain zones within the building. There are other related life safety and operational considerations. There's just a lot of complexities, even in a simple building. And whether we talk about the big box to the small standalone, that standalone may be, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 square feet. There's a significant level of risk there, depending upon the construction and the occupancy, where the fire is, and where our personnel are at a particular point in time during the deployment. So a lot of moving parts to it.
And one of the things to keep in mind as well is, and we've talked about this, and especially putting it into your thought process for tactical deployment, is this time of year, the hours are different and the occupancy loading is drastically different as well. And we have to take that into consideration for the rescue components, the focus on that, the responses for that. And in addition with especially if we go multi-story in some of these commercial buildings, or especially if they have a second floor or a loft area that's there, the amount of loading that's going into that with your live loads and your dead loads, those pieces that are going into the component of complexities that you have to account for this time of year. But occupancy is something that comes out, not just how it's occupied, but how populated it is in some of these buildings, and how easy it is for folks to get lost and no accountability to how many people could be in a commercial building.
I think the occupancy load is another critical factor when we talk about the uniqueness of commercial buildings. So when we talk about challenges and preparation, I think we have to garner a degree of respect for the building's function and use, and what the occupancy may be, both in terms of the public and those that service the building, meaning the employees. So during certain periods of the year, holiday seasons and other seasons, or when we transition from one seasonal type of condition, let's say from winter to summer, or such as down in in your area, where you're transitioning to a larger increase in population because we're going from summer to winter, and that's going to create an entirely different type of population that's going to be coming forward and then going into these particular buildings. So it is the employees that are going to be there depending upon their hours of operation. It's the seasonal aspects of it, and then those that frequent the building based upon the hours of operation. So there's also special conditions and special sales that occur during two different times of year. So occupancy load becomes critical in recognizing that it also may fluctuate seasonally during the course of the year. So, we've got to plan for that. Even though we're planning for the building, we're dealing with certain aspects of the building, its function, its use. Think about this, because many times our listeners do not. And we hear it time and time again when we are presenting and interfacing with our audience and our students in the classroom session, is that we are not considering the occupancy aspect enough because of the numbers of people that may be in these particular buildings. So that's a critical component in the planning process. Do I have enough personnel to do an initial search? Where are they going to go? Again, if there's a point of egress that normally is the point that you're entering into that building, and let's say there is a significant event that's occurring in the checkout area, you may find a sizable population of individuals that were occupying that building that may be in storage rooms or other areas of refuge that we have to think about alternate means to get to, and then also think about alternate means to get them out of. It's not always point of entry, point of exit. We've got to be considering all of these other aspects if they are available.
One of the other pieces that comes to play right after what was in the training is in 4.9 of 1620, and that's after a post-incident. And a lot of times we'll run calls and it won't be as serious. We're running the alarms or we're running the medical calls into the building, and that's a perfect time to actually take a look at what's there, what's not there. And it says, post-incident, we're supposed to be reviewing what's actually in our pre-plans. And nowhere in there does it say what type of incident. It says post-incident. So when we have the opportunity to be in buildings, and especially if we have some type of a working incident from a fire perspective, is that we begin looking at the pre-plan, and did we pre-plan it correctly? Do we have all the information? Did we strategically, plan out what we were supposed to be doing or how we would do this specifically? And then if it's not correct or that needs to be updated or there's been changes, then you have to modify your pre-incident survey. And that's a perfect time. That's a perfect training piece. But that's part of what's required in there is for you to be training on these. And pre-incident surveys, especially if you're in the second or third due, you may not be able to get over to that building, but you're going to be responsible for the response into that with a certain component that's going to be within your tactical objectives within your organization. And you need to be reviewing those. You need to be talking about or planning. And when you can swap districts to look at these, or you get a chance to be over there off of another alarm, swing through and just take a look at some of these buildings that could be target hazards for you. And that's important. And I think we fail to do that on a regular basis, Chris, as a fire service across the United States. I think we fail at that miserably.
Well, it's usually one and done. We invest that limited amount of time to obtain that initial building intel and data information, capture it, put it into whatever type of database or access base that we have. We may visit it on occasion, and unfortunately, we see time and time again, especially within incident after action reports, the NIOSH reports, or other significant event reporting, that the frequency of keeping up with changes in that building, the accuracy of the information. So again, we try to oversimplify it, although the NFPA standards provide some really useful templates. You've got to modify the template based upon the building's associated hazards and risks, the footprint, the complexities, and other related items. So there is a skeletal baseline amount of information that needs to be drawn out and expanded, and then also to be inclusive of tactical and command considerations. I think that uniquely there are pre-incident information that is very, very useful at the company tactical level, and then there's another set of parameters and data points and information that relate back to the building intel that are more useful at the command level. So it's not always I've got to bunch it all together. They can sometimes be distinctively binned in and be extracted based upon the operational needs. And I would add the other note to this is that do not be afraid to share that information, and again, at the command level. So if we talk about some of the things that are affecting us, we've got access to the information either via our computer terminals, via that type of electronic database, or the hard copies that are available to us at the command post. We sometimes do not verbally communicate that over the radio or make use of our runners to take that information and communicate that face-to-face at a forward tactical position, so that those that are operating either at the command or the tactical positions in the forward positions of operation have that type of data and information available to us. So, it's that short circuiting. We have either access to it and we're failing to communicate, or we don't have the information and we're flying by the seat of our pants. So sometimes it's one or the other. But I think I would say that more often than not, if the question to the audience is this: how many of you have pre-fire plans that are up to date of some of your, let's say, just targeted hazards of commercial buildings? That's a great thing. But the question is, rhetorically, do you even have them? And if you don't, why not? And I'm sure we can answer the question of why not very easily, because don't have time, don't have interest, nobody's telling us to do it. I'm too busy with other related conditions. Oh, they're protected properties. This is what we're told that building can do under fire conditions. Therefore, there's this false sense of security about the severity, the urgency, the hazards associated with the events, and the probability of the events even occurring.
And again, Chris, this comes back down, and I'm going to pinpoint whose responsibility this is. This is the company officer. This is the ones that are the ones running the calls, making decisions, initially pulling up on these buildings, and they're the ones generally that are working with pre-incident surveys. And it falls back to them, and I think it's a critical part that it's not the most sexy thing that we go out and we have the opportunity to do from a training perspective, but it's probably one of the most critical ones that we fail to utilize or do at the level that I think that we need to be doing them. And again, that's one of the challenges about these commercial buildings is they dynamically change. I know I can go in one building. A good example is grocery stores. You can go in a grocery store one day, and the next week you're in there and they've completely moved the aisles around. Or Walmarts are famous for this. These big box stores that you go into, and all of a sudden it's one way one day, and then they completely rearrange things, and that changes the dynamics of your thought process, your operation, some of your strategic plans when it comes to how you're going to deploy hose lines, how you're actually going to do search and rescue, target areas to where you need to get to for people that could be high hazard, like the pharmacies or those type of things. And then especially, you're probably not going to change the dynamics of they have an automotive component to it. But again, you move one thing from one place, one to the other. And a lot of times they don't think about what happens when you put product A next to product B, and product A and product B now mix. That's a whole nother component.
I think that one of the important aspects, we talk about pre-fire planning. So here's another little tidbit for our listeners. Go out, whether it be the Walmart, whether it be the Target, or the Home Depots or the Lowe's or whatever building and occupancy type, small or large, and then take a look at the orientation of the layouts. And again, think about the other types of stores that you have gone into. There are very distinctive types of arrangements that are pretty common, and there's 10 different common types of arrangements in terms of aisleways, travel locations, how businesses, and especially on the commercial side, lead you in and through a building. Sometimes it's in a particular primary entry point, and you're going down these very specific types of aisles. Other times, you're going through them in a diagonal standpoint, almost like a serpentine. So there are very distinctive types of travel arrangements, and the orientation of product displays, shelving, and other types of storage areas. The other part of that is the distinctive types of departments in which certain products are sold. So by code, there has to be certain separations in terms of where the automotive section may be, the lubricants, combustibles and flammables, and other commodities, and especially when we're in a particular mixed-use type of occupancy, which for many of our listeners, and again, there's no distinction, and for the record, we're not saying anything negative about Walmart, but Walmart as an example, because of our listeners frequently them and the readily available buildings that are out there. So when you go into that Walmart setting, take a look at how things are separated from that commodity standpoint, many of which have food preparation, distribution, and the supermarket component, the retail portion that's normally in the middle, and then at the far other end are normally our garden supplies, sporting goods, automotives, and so forth. So there are separation by positioning in terms of the footprint, but how good is that depending upon when we start mixing everything together in a seasonal standpoint? and you're making a great point, because just the other day, as we transitioned from the Thanksgiving period to the current holiday period in the month of December, one particular store that I was into was just in the middle of that transition, and they were moving all sorts of things around because you're serving a different type of display, serving a different type of promotion that uniquely starts creating dead zones and areas that you may not be able to access, or that you had committed to memory that I'm going to enter in this particular door, I'm going to make a turn, I'm going to find a particular aisleway, it's going to lead me to a particular location, and that very well may not be the case. So a lot of diversity, and that is becoming more and more common when we talk about these risk factors.
And just a risk factor to throw out there, Chris. Not long ago, we had an opportunity to go into one of those beach bargain stores, and they had a small incident in there, and basically it was mostly smoke removal. But when we went into the back, what's behind the scenes that you don't see, there were multiple layers within the backs of that building to where they were storing things. One of the things we came across was somewhere close to 5,000 boogie boards, which is basically foam rubber. Now, this particular store was a major hub for the distribution out of that particular storage component of those to multiple stores throughout, our region here. So you got to stop and think about it. How much fuel load was in that building specific to that, again, was it fire protected? Was it sprinklered? Those type of pieces that go into a pre-plan with fuel loadings and the transition of the time of year. Now, what they're doing, they're stockpiling right now, because come springtime, what's going to happen? All those are going to go out as we start getting the beachgoers coming in, especially during the peak summer season, when a lot of the tourism comes to the beach and, are out on the beach using those type of products. They get sold. So they stockpile and they take them out. It's the same thing that happens in other retail type stores with their commodities that we have to look at. So that's a critical piece that we need to be looking at, because part of what we're doing in pre-incident surveys and planning is, determining what's really there for the building, what's there for the contents, what's there for the protection systems, and then ultimately the occupancy that we have to worry about, because life safety is, one of our main focuses. And the life safety, first of all, for our own responding folks, but also for the citizens and the public that we're serving.
Well, not everything is going to be code compliant either. I mean, you talk about seasonal inventories. We're seeing what used to be very distinctive seasons that were defined by certain months and periods of time, and one season or one holiday or period or commodities that would come and go. But now they're becoming sort of grayed out. So, seasonal types of displays. Here's the other thing. So for our listeners, when did the Christmas displays suddenly start arriving and being put up into the stores? Well, Halloween wasn't done in October, and we're seeing some of the Christmas types of commodities or that seasonal type of material suddenly coming on displays and increasing the things that were on the public side. So I think it goes back to saying, what's behind the door? What's behind in the storage areas, within the staging areas, within the loading dock locations? And chances are, if you have not gone back into the loading docks in a while, I would encourage our listeners to get those companies out there. Take a look at what's on the back side of our buildings. Take a look at loading docks, compactor locations, the primary receiving and distribution locations, and accessibility. Talk about standpipe systems. Talk about sprinkler systems. Talk about any of the access doors. I mean, that 360 on the outside of the building, showing up either on the engine, sometimes before committing on the entry point of that particular structure. Get your drive around done to take a look at some other factors before you commit, whether it be at the first due company or the first due or second due arriving commanding officer. There's a lot of things going on here that, as we get into this conversation through our series here, we're going to start identifying all of these aspects. There's aspects related, as we're talking about here, from a pre-planning standpoint of the building footprint. identifying how that building is sited, topography, landscaping, accessibility. What's the accessibility during the daytime when we're encountering certain population densities regarding the civilians that are present in the building, occupancy loading, the numbers of vehicles that are going to be present. What happens during the nighttime? What happens during weather inclement conditions? I know that in the Northeast, we're always considering snow arrival, snow banks, and limited access conditions that we take for granted when the weather is good, but sometimes they are very imposing factors. So I think when we talk about the challenges, you've got to look at that footprint. We have an after appreciation of how that building is sited and that footprint in terms of its square footage and the volume, the topography and the grade changes, whether they be flat or with some other type of landscaping conditions, accessibility points for the access and the removal of both civilians and employees, as well as our accessibility into that particular structure, environmental impacts that might be encountered, and then the seasonal related conditions that come about. But first and foremost, it's understanding how that building sits and how that building is going to exist. That leads us into our next conversation during part two. We start talking a little bit more about the construction component of it. But we're just talking about the tip of the iceberg here in this brief episode. I mean, we could talk about some of the specifics of these challenges quite extensively. And again, as you just talked about too, Doug, just even in terms of the training, how many of our listeners that are listening in on the program, when was the last time you did a tabletop on a commercial building? It doesn't have to be a big box, but when was the last time you did a small tabletop talking about strategical and operational issues for that small fast food restaurant or that small commercial or retail building, whether it be the standalone or that small strip commercial building that has, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000 square foot tenant spaces, of which you have 3 or 4 units together, and that's one little standalone building. But collectively, you've got 15 or 18,000 square feet, different occupancy types, different occupancy risks. Again, L-shaped, square-shaped, rectangular. What's the training? Do we understand deployment? Do we understand a different tactical level, tactical windows, ventilation, flow paths, vent paths? And now we get more and more into this level of detail here on all of those particular challenges.
So I think one of the things that we need to make our listeners aware of right now, Chris, is that this is a multi-part series. And we're going to dive deep down into a lot more detail as we go forward. This is kind of an introduction, a thought process to training about pre-incident planning, getting a mindset set for these commercial style buildings that we're dealing with that are in your jurisdictions. It's in our jurisdictions that we deal with. They're, one of those low frequency, high risk events, as Gordon Graham talks about, that can get you in trouble in a heartbeat if you're not prepared. But, as we were talking about that, part 3 is the commercial Fireground operations and what we'll be doing tactically for many of these buildings. But I think the next piece that we're going to be hitting, Chris, is probably one of the most critical ones, is understanding the Fireground, the building construction, and the risks that are associated with it, because all these buildings are built different. And the late, great Francis Brannigan used to talk about the Type 6 construction, and he used to say the other crap. And he said, that's when you hodgepodge everything together. And, what do you do with it? How do you look at it? But there's a lot of things that have changed. And then there's a lot of new type of building materials that are going into these that I think we need to talk about that are in commercial structures. And I'm looking forward to part 2, which is on your show, which is very, very quickly coming upon us. And we'll be taking a look at that as we look at, Buildings on Fire, taking it to the streets with your show, Chris, which is next up.
That's very good. And again, that's a great way to transition out of our conversation. So we've talked about today's challenges. We talked a little bit about preparation. We've introduced you to some insights on some of the standards that are out there, a couple of other insights on some other resources and such. But again, we are just starting into this conversation. And again, there's challenges, there's preparation. You've got to have that building intel. You've got to start somewhere. Take a look at what you currently have accessible or access to in terms of information. Is it formal? Is it informal? The other component, are you personally prepared? Do you have knowledge, training, skill set levels? What's the gap? Identify the gap to prepare yourselves for those next alarms. And don't let complacency creep come in, because again, as Doug mentioned, low frequency, high risk potential, a lot of things as we get into our series, a lot of things can go wrong in a heartbeat. And you've got to have a greater degree of respect of what can occur within that tactical period of operations in these types of commercials. And today's commercial Fireground, again, is creating a lot of those challenges, especially as Doug just mentioned, specific to the hybrid structures. We just do not sometimes have the ability to figure things out until we're right in the thick of things. And we'll talk more about those things in some of our future episodes here on the commercial Fireground.
Well, Chris, as always, it's great to combine our shows together with Fire and Training and Buildings on Fire, taking it to the streets. It's always good when we collaborate and we can put together a top-notch program that dives deep into the heart of topics that we're talking about, that covers not only risks, training, preparation, construction features, and of course, the tactical deployments that we need to be successful on our fire grounds. I want to thank the listeners for tuning in this evening to another edition of Fire and Training, combined with Buildings on Fire, Taking It to the Street, with my good friend and colleague, Christopher Naum. Our goal is to provide you with the best knowledge, the best education that we possibly can for the men and women who are out in the streets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to keep them safe. And the ultimate goal is for everyone to go home. Till the next time we're together, we'll see you on another edition of Fire and Training and Buildings on Fire, Taking It to the Street.
TheFireStore.com, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can make the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at TheFireStore.com and shop our deals page.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.